Everybody to jump on. Uh, Sidak Atnakasan, Sidak Stephanie Carroll, Tishu Stas, Landek Nalchina. I welcome you all to our Indigenous Data Sovereignty International Interest Group here at the Research Data Alliance. Happy to have convene this meeting virtually for the RDA 24th plenary. My name is Stephanie Carroll. I am Atna from the native village of Kudikan, Alaska. I'm here currently on unceded O'odham lands, now shared with the Pasquayaqui tribe in Tucson or Tucson, Arizona. And we create this space to bring Indigenous rights and interest into the RDA. Doing so in, I believe, 2016 was our first introductory work here. And our, I think, biggest claim to fame is that the CARE principles were created at an RDA plenary co-convened with the International Data Week in Botswana in 2018. And so very glad to be coming back to this space with advancements of the CARE data maturity model and an UNDRIP model for Indigenous rights within data and so forth. Next slide, Riley. We'll have our other presenters introduce themselves as they are speaking. So today we have two things really on our agenda other than introductions and Dr. Riley Teitingfong will provide an introduction to IDSAV and IDGov. We'll have a brief Q&A. After that, that's just a norming activity because I think I see some familiar faces here. So you can see how we've evolved in our language around those topics. And then Dr. Ibrahim Garba will talk about an UNDRIP or UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples relational model for data governance, and we'll have a feedback session. And then Riley will come back again to share an update on the CARE data maturity model and look for some feedback on that process as well. Next slide. So largely our objectives are to show you where we are in terms of thinking about CARE and applications of CARE within research data environments and gathering feedback as we proceed to create the CARE data maturity model. Next slide. Alrighty, so as a reminder, code of conduct you can find at the link in the chat. Please be respectful in the space. I always ask people when we get to the point of feedback and conversation to remember if you're a person who speaks up a lot to potentially leave space for those who might not. And so if you do not speak up a lot, step forward too. And then also a note here that we do have our group page and our collaborative notes. Here's the collaborative notes for any of you who want to share in that space with us. Next slide. Alrighty, I'm going to hand over to Riley for this. Thank you, Riley, and welcome again, everybody. Oh, can I ask one thing? What we like to do in our sessions too is to have everybody put in the chat and in the notes if you're comfortable, your name and affiliation. It's easier for us if you put them in the chat right now as we monitor the chat. So please, I will start with my example and you can all listen to Riley.
Thank you, Stephanie. Hello, everyone. Buenas and Hafade, Todesamzu, Guasi Riley, Taiting Fong. I'm Riley. I've greeted you in the language of the Indigenous Chamorro people. My family originally hails from Micronesia, from the island of Guahan or Guam, and I am also of mixed European descent. I am a postdoc working with Stephanie and Ibrahim and others at the University of Arizona's Native Nations Institute and with our Collaboratory for Indigenous Data Governance. So, as mentioned, we're going to do a quick kind of high-level introduction to Indigenous data sovereignty and Indigenous data governance. As Professor Carroll said, many of you may be familiar with these concepts, so you can see how we're kind of framing some of these things these days. So first, we like to just recognize that really anyone working with Indigenous data has a responsibility to uphold Indigenous people's rights and interests in their data. And so data governance that upholds these rights relies on sort of the coordination, the institutional transformation, the commitment of many different individuals, organizations, and institutions. So we've listed a variety of these here, right? NGOs, individual researchers, or archivists, or librarians, federal agencies, other kinds of governments, repositories, universities. Maybe there's other organizations not listed here that you may be part of, but essentially anyone working within these contexts that interacts with data belonging to Indigenous peoples has these responsibilities to uphold their rights and interests in their data. And at the foundation of all of this, informing those actions must be the Indigenous peoples and communities to whom those data relate. And so now we'll put kind of some finer points on some definitions so that we have shared sense of concepts and language that we're really working through in this plenary session. So what are Indigenous data? We define Indigenous data as data, information, and knowledges in any format that impacts Indigenous peoples, nations, and communities at the collective and individual levels. So this includes data about Indigenous peoples' non-human relations, data about Indigenous peoples as individuals and as collectives. And so, you know, obviously not a comprehensive list here, but just some examples. Indigenous data are anything from information about our traditional territories, water, our soil, sacred ecosystems, our other non-human kin, and even things like census data, administrative or health data, corporate and commercial data, as well as, you know, our languages, our traditional knowledges as well. Okay, and so what then is Indigenous data sovereignty, or IDSOV, as you'll hear us use in the shorthand? IDSOV refers to, again, the rights of Indigenous peoples and nations to govern the collection, ownership, and application of their own data. Indigenous data sovereignty is grounded in the inherent rights of Indigenous peoples to self-determine the use of their lands and resources and to govern their own communities. It also has its genesis in the traditions or roles and responsibilities that we carry as Indigenous peoples to steward our knowledge systems. Additionally, it's positioned within a human rights framework and different court cases, treaties, and/or recognition. You'll hear us discuss today the United Nations rights on the Declaration of Indigenous Peoples as an example of one sort of international mechanism that enshrines Indigenous peoples' rights, including to govern their data. And then finally, IDSOV also acknowledges and affirms that knowledge belongs to the collective and is fundamental to who we are as Indigenous peoples. Okay. So again, Indigenous data sovereignty is really the rights of Indigenous peoples and nations to govern their data from collection to use and reuse and everything in between. And then this other important term here, IDGov, or Indigenous data governance, really refers to the specific mechanisms that are put in place to realize Indigenous data sovereignty. Okay. We're going to dig into some different models for Indigenous data governance in this session today. And one important point on IDGov is that Indigenous peoples have, for a very long time now, sort of established principles at different levels or scales of governance when it comes to taking care of their data. At the sort of broad, high international level, this includes principles such as the CARE principles for Indigenous data governance, which I'll say more about in a minute and we'll talk about today. At the level of the region, this includes principles such as OCAP, which is out of the Canada or First Nations context and refers to ownership, control, access, and possession. Additionally, the principles of Maori data sovereignty are another example of Indigenous data governance at that regional level, applying to iwi or tribes in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And then finally, at the most sort of granular level, you have the Indigenous data governance principles at the level of the Indigenous nation. So different tribes or Indigenous communities, their own policies, protocols, regulations, et cetera, for the care of their data. Okay, so this brings us to the creation of the CARE principles. And as Professor Carroll mentioned, these really came together through the collaboration of Indigenous and allied scholars back at the 2018 Botswana RDA meeting. And so this was initiated with an exercise to sort of compare what the qualities were between sort of mainstream data principles and Indigenous peoples' principles for the care of their data. And what they found was that mainstream data principles tended to focus more on the qualities of sort of discrete data objects, right? This, for example, relates to the FAIR principles, which are findable, accessible, interoperable, reusable, right? Other kinds of principles really focusing on the data qualities of the data themselves, right? Now, when Indigenous peoples had created principles for the care of their knowledge and data, these were much more people and purpose oriented, right? You see examples across sort of the Kansas states, Canada, US, New Zealand, Australia, and the qualities of these principles are focusing on anything from Indigenous peoples' collective rights and interests to intergenerational well-being and more. And so this is the point from which the CARE principles were created, was really with this intention to sow the people and purpose orientation back into data principles. And so CARE is an acronym that stands for collective benefit, which recognizes that data ecosystems should be designed and function in ways that enable Indigenous peoples to derive benefit from the use of their data. A is for authority to control, which recognizes that Indigenous peoples' rights and interests in their own data must be recognized and their authority upheld. And this is really what we see as the heart of the CARE principles. R stands for responsibility, and this is really looking at the relationship piece of data governance. And this affirms that those working with Indigenous data have a responsibility to share how those data are being used, again, to uphold Indigenous people's rights to their data and ensure that they're deriving benefit from the use of their data. And then finally, E, ethics, refers to Indigenous people's rights and well-being, kind of being at the center of all stages of the data life cycle and data ecosystem. And then underneath each, we have 3 sub-principles as well. Okay. I'll pause depending on how we're doing on time, just to see if there's any kind of clarifying questions about these concepts or definitions so far. Or anything to add from my colleagues as well. Let me open the gallery. No questions? All right, if you have questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. At this point, I'll remind everyone that the CARE principles are hosted on the Global Indigenous Data Alliance site, so you're welcome to access more information about them there. And at this point, I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Dr. Ibrahim Garba, to walk us through his progress on the UNDRIP model.
Thank you, Riley. So my name, you can hear me okay, I'm presuming? I'll assume so. Excuse me. So my name is Ibrahim Garba. I'm from a tribe in West Africa, and I've been here in the States for about 2 decades, where I work and live these days. But I was going to discuss the UNDRIP model, probably more precisely, maybe an UNDRIP-based model, because the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, as Riley has mentioned, is an international legal document. But from the Indigenous perspective, the focus probably is more on what it represents rather than the document itself. So for convenience, we say the UNDRIP model, but from an Indigenous perspective, probably the underlying principles are we're more concerned about. All right, next slide, please. Okay, and I'll just do a quick overview of what the plan is for my section here. So I'll discuss a bit of the project that gave rise to the model itself. So there's a funded project from NSF that provides a context for it. So I'll go briefly over that and then go into the declaration itself and the principle or right of self-determination broadly. And then the model focuses more on data. So basically starting off from UNDRIP and the principle of self-determination, then applying it specifically to data in the model. And then there'll be a session toward the end to get your thoughts on clarity, questions, and some background on it. But yes, I think I'm ready for the next slide, please. Next slide. All right, so it's a mouthful here. That was the title of the project as it was submitted to the National Science Foundation a few years ago. But basically what the project is about is looking at the governance of Indigenous data at research institutions, especially universities. And so that's the institutional context. It doesn't say it in the title, but that's where kind of the domain that we're looking at when we're thinking of the model. Next slide, please. So here are just some brief statements, a lot of it actually taken from the proposal itself. But of note, as far as the research problem goes, one of the reasons or motivations for the project was the discussions about open science and open data and what happens to research and Indigenous rights and responsibilities when those two come together. As some of you may know, whenever there's discussions of open anything or frontiers, it's often a constructed space, not necessarily open or free. And so it's always of concern to have a discussion about Indigenous resources and data whenever the idea of openness or frontiers comes up. And then as I've noted before, the focus is on universities specifically, so research at academic institutions, but a lot of the background research we did in getting to the model looked at governance of Indigenous data at institutions generally. All right, next slide, please. Next slide. All right, so on to the UN Declaration itself. It was adopted by the UN or international community, as some other people like to refer to it, in 2007. Riley mentioned the Kansas countries, all four of those, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the US, voted against it, and then over the next few years eventually signed it. Partly, presumably because they're all former British colonies and also have significant Indigenous populations. It's the first international law document committed solely to Indigenous rights. There have been other treaties and other documents that refer to Indigenous rights, but this puts them all together. So it covers areas like education, lands and territories, religion, language, and Article 31, which I won't put up in this presentation, refers to data in particular. So very comprehensive, and it's worth a skim, even just looking at what topics are covered in there. What's also unique about its development was that Indigenous peoples were involved in the drafting at the UN. The UN is more or less a league or collection of nation states. And so whenever treaties or documents are developed, they tend to reflect the interests of the states. So the UN Declaration might be a little unique in that there was a permanent body of Indigenous peoples that were involved in the development of it. So in that sense, it has a certain amount of legitimacy is too strong a word, but it's important that in its crafting, there was quite a bit of Indigenous involvement, as opposed to other treaties, perhaps, that are developed. And then the last point I want to point out on the, excuse me, on the declaration generally is that the keystone of the declaration is self-determination. And so I'll, in the next slide, go a bit more into that. All right, thanks, Riley. And so there are different definitions for self-determination, but this is language from international human rights. So I put these two definitions together. You can see the similarity in language. And in the next slide, I'll describe why it's important to kind of see it as a progression and why there's shared language across different international documents. But all peoples have the right of self-determination, freely determine their political status, and freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural development. And I think that's very key in understanding why data governance is very important in the context of self-determination. Without control over data, especially in modern states that are very bureaucratic, the control of information is more or less the control of power. And it's very difficult to talk about self-determination when Indigenous peoples do not have control over their data. So that's just a general definition from international law documents on what self-determination is. I'll say more about this later, but it's important that self-determination is a collective right. It attaches to peoples. It is not an individual right. There's a separate regime, which I'll refer to separately for individual rights. So one way to think about UNDRIP is that it makes, excuse me, this broader right of all peoples and makes it specific to Indigenous peoples in particular. Next slide, please. All right, so this is just a slide that puts the idea of self or principle or right of self-determination in context. It's not a new conversation. It's been going on, at least the modern idea of self-determination is over a century old. But after World War I, and you will note that all these happen after wars, because some of these conversations require that kind of disruption, perhaps, to change the order. But after World War I, self-determination was applied to a lot of Eastern European countries that used to be part of some 19th century empires. After World War II and the formation of the UN, self-determination was applied, excuse me, to a lot of countries that were also former colonies, mainly of Britain and some of the other European powers. And so, including my home country, Nigeria, got independence in 1960. So that was a second wave of self-determination in international law. And then after the Cold War, 1989, with the fall of the Berlin Wall, some people use that as a convenient marker. You then had discussions about the rights of Indigenous peoples and self-determination. What is different from these, as opposed to the other two, is that it's not necessarily territorially bound. There are aspects of land and territory, but the discussion around Indigenous rights has not been about forming new states in international law. They've tended to be more about self-determination and how to create a just system of governance within existing nation states. All right, next slide, please. All right, so there are two things I want to emphasize about the idea of self-determination as I move more toward the idea of the model itself. And these two are important, kind of understanding how the model works. And I apologize for spending so much time with this background. I'm trying to look forward to getting the feedback. So I'm trying to slowly kind of tell the story of how the model formed and give some background so that we can, you have more to work with. So two things about the principle of self-determination in international law is that it is collective in the sense that it belongs to peoples. Individual rights are different. And so when we talk of self-determination, we're actually referring to collective rights that belong to peoples or collectives as such, and not just an aggregate of individuals. And then the second is that it is binary. It has internal and external components, and I'll say more about that in the slides following. Next slide, please. All right, so these two slides are going to talk about the collective aspects of self-determination. And one way to think in these two slides, what I'll do is contrast individual rights, so the provisions in international law for for individual rights, and then contrast it with Indigenous rights, which are collective rights. And so Article 2 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights talks about this idea, basically the basic statement of individual rights. Everyone is entitled to all the rights and freedoms set forth in this declaration. And there are all these distinctions: race, color, sex, language, religion. So it doesn't matter what your membership is in all these things. The Universal Declaration articulates its rights that attach to you as an individual. Article 1 of the UN Declaration of Indigenous rights makes this distinction. So it says Indigenous peoples have the right to full enjoyment as a collective or as individuals. And it's very key that this distinction is made. In other words, it's not that Indigenous rights are post-individual rights, but that it's a complementary framework that protects both individual and collective aspects. Right, so that's, excuse me, one distinction between indigenous rights, collective rights, and then the individual rights regime in international law. Next slide. And then this second slide does the same thing. In the top, these are provisions that talk about participation. So a nation state that's a member of the UN is obligated to uphold these rights and basically to preserve justice within their borders. And so there are these two individual rights of participation and then collective rights of participation. And the first, you can see it in the language, and feel free to pay attention to that highlighted green text. Those are what I'm trying to focus on. So in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which is another major human rights treaty, every citizen shall have the right to participate in public affairs. And you can see how UNDRIP on participation, Article 18, talks of Indigenous peoples have the right to participate in decision-making. So again, you have this collective participation and then individual participation. All right, next slide, please. So we now move from the collective aspects of self-determination, so the focus on collective rights and not just individual rights, to this other aspect of self-determination, which has an internal and external component. So the internal component, and I'm hoping when I discuss the two slides together, it'll become a little clearer. But basically, the internal component is focused on Indigenous peoples being able to make decisions and to govern their own affairs through their own institutions. It preserves that right. So Article 4 talks of the right to autonomy and self-governance or self-government relating to their own affairs. And then it talks about Indigenous decision-making institutions. So that's the internal component. In some ways, these rights are trying to protect Indigenous peoples from encroachment by nation state and other actors on their rights. Next slide, please. All right, so the external component now is almost a complement. So you have internal rights for autonomy, and then you have this external component that is focused on the obligations or relationship of Indigenous peoples to mainly the nation state. So Indigenous peoples have the right to participate in decision-making on matters which affect their rights. And that decision-making refers to the decision-making processes of external entities. So governments in UNDRIP, but then in the model, we're also referring to all those in that first slide that Riley showed that had funders, universities, repositories, all these external data users would fall into this, that Indigenous peoples have a right to participate in those decision-making processes to the extent that they affect their rights. And then Article 19 talks of an obligation to consult. Again, in UNDRIP, it refers specifically to nation states, but there's this idea that in order for this external component of self-determination to exist, external entities have these minimum obligations of having, at the very minimum, a relationship of consultation or cooperation. Next slide, please. So Article 5 does a good job of combining these two things, the internal and external components. So Indigenous peoples have the right to maintain and strengthen their distinct political, legal, economic, social, cultural institutions. So that's internal autonomy, while retaining their right to participate fully, if they so choose, which is very important, in the political, economic, and social cultural life of the state. I'm trying to emphasize here that self-determination has these two components. Indigenous peoples have a right to autonomy, and then external entities have an obligation to make the decisions and priorities of Indigenous peoples operative in their institutions. All right, next slide, please. Next slide. Thank you. So given that background, I hope it will make the discussion of the actual model a little smoother, because all of that is it's like the engine under the hood or bonnet, depending on where you are. And now we're actually getting to the principles and see how they might apply in the data context. So the three elements, we can call them different things. Elements are just convenient. We have internal autonomy, which you should recognize from the internal component of self-determination, collective authority, which ties back to that idea of collective rights for Indigenous peoples, and then external participation, which corresponds to the external component of self-determination. So those are the discussion I just had built up to these three principles, and then how do they apply in research or data contexts? I'll try to do briefly in the next few slides. Next slide, please. So in the green text is more or less a summary of what that element of the model is doing. So research governance protects Indigenous resources and responds to eternal needs and priorities. So that's what internal autonomy is trying to do. And for each of these principles, there are some guiding questions. Again, these are not exhaustive. It's just a way to think about when you are analyzing a policy or some governance structure. These are some questions that would help you guide and assess whether that document or governance has it. So does a policy mention Indigenous beliefs, cultures, traditions, protocols, practices? Does a policy mention control, ownership, or claims, legal claims over lands, resources, or data? So that's the first element of the model. Next slide, please. And so this is an example of a Indigenous research policy at the University of Minnesota, which came into effect within the last year. And so with the examples, I'll just take literal text from the policy to give an illustration. Again, not perfect, but just an illustrative example of what that might look like in a policy. So for internal autonomy, the inherent right of Indigenous tribes to collect, store, manage, apply their own data. So you have mentioned their ownership is derived from the tribe's inherent right to govern their people's lands and resources. So again, you have that idea of internal autonomy, that Indigenous peoples have the right to self-government or autonomy over matters that pertain to them. Next slide. Thank you. So the second element is collective authority. And the summary is more or less that the research governance should support the right of Indigenous peoples as political collectives, not just individual citizens, to choose and pursue. And that's just the language from the principle of self-determination. So the key takeaway here is, does that policy or governance arrangement recognize the collective legal status of the Indigenous peoples connected to the data that's being used? So examples of guiding questions is the policy mention a relationship with Indigenous governing institutions. So not just an advisory board or council put together by the researcher for a project, but the actual governance mechanism for that Indigenous people. And then there's a policy mention laws, policies, or protocols, again, attached officially to the Indigenous peoples as a political collective. Next slide, please. All right, and so this is an example again from that research policy from the University of Minnesota. Acquiring tribal consent can only happen after establishing a reciprocal relationship with a tribal nation or Indigenous partner. And the focus here is on tribal nation. In other words, if a researcher is putting a proposal through this research institution, there won't be any consent believed to have occurred unless it is with a nation. So not just a group of Indigenous individuals or experts you've gathered, but the actual official body. All right, next slide, please. And then the third one, external participation. Indigenous peoples need to be engaged as political collectives to shape external, so this can be state, federal, institutional, national, pick your level, to shape research policies, processes, and activities that impact their citizens and members. And this tends to be, at least at the start, one of the most challenging. It's one thing to acknowledge Indigenous rights rhetorically or to be an ally, but what does it look like for an institution or entity handling Indigenous data to alter the way it does business to not just accommodate, but to respect the rights of Indigenous peoples? So some guiding questions: does a policy mention a special or designated body or position? So for example, a committee or an office within the institution responsible for Indigenous research. Does the policy mention any distinct administrative or other requirements for researchers, students, or others who are engaging these research projects? So again, these are just guiding questions when you're assessing a policy to see whether that element of external participation is acknowledged. Next slide, please. Then examples from that policy at the University of Minnesota, all researchers, regardless of their role, are required to complete the tribal university relations training modules available through the institution. So again, there's a requirement for researchers within the institution. So this is not a requirement from outside. The institution itself is making these requirements. And then, let me see. Yeah, so these are some of the requirements are the funding for the research will not be released by the institution unless some of these requirements are met. And so for external participation, again, given that model, we have internal autonomy, collective authority, and external participation is basically focusing on the institutions that handle Indigenous data. And the question is whether there are procedural, administrative, personnel elements in the governance of that institution that recognize those rights, Indigenous rights as collectives. Do we do business in a way that resonates or accounts for those? All right, next slide. I think I'm coming up against time here. And this is just a graphic to help illustrate perhaps how these work. So on the left, we have Indigenous peoples, on the right, external data actors. And the top arc there in the discussions we have in IDSolve is governance of data. On the bottom arc, data for governance. In other words, Indigenous people should be able to govern the use of their data, which is the red arrow. But the data that is being used and developed should also be useful. In other words, should have a benefit to the Indigenous people. So there's this, if you want to call it a virtuous cycle. That's another thing to point there. So anyway, internal autonomy, as you can see, kind of sits over Indigenous peoples having the right of self-governance. Any processes for governing data need to acknowledge the collective authority of Indigenous peoples. And then any policies or processes at the external data user institution needs to account for these. And speaking of care, which Riley talked about earlier and which you'll go into again, one way to think about that top arrow is authority to control. That's what that red arrow is showing. And then the arrow going back, you can think of in terms of collective benefit, which is the C in care. All right, next slide, please. And so this is a feedback session. Again, feel free to ask questions, and then I'd be very happy to get your feedback on the model itself, its clarity, its uses, and then one of the things that'll come out of this project is also some outputs. So given where you are standing, given what this model is, what tools or outcomes would you think would be useful for you or others who use data? So it's open season here. And Riley, maybe we could go back one slide to just leave it up in case it helps people think about it. All right, thank you very much. And I look forward to hearing any questions. I'll check the chat also. Someone did ask about the slides, and it sounds like those will be made available. So yes, Andrew.
Ibrahim and Stephanie and Riley, hi. Thank you for that comprehensive overview. I guess my question would be one of trying to think of the right word for it. Positioning. So a little bit of context. So in Australia, sorry, I'm from Australia. I work for the Australian Research Data Commons. I'm also involved in the next International Data Week. There's been a reference to the one in Botswana already. So in Australia, we now have both fair and care written into our National Digital Research Infrastructure Strategy and our National Research Infrastructure Roadmap. So that's great. I guess my question would be, should we also be encouraging compliance with or engagement with the UND RIP principles as well? or should we be focusing on making sure that the stated commitment to compliance with the care principles actually gets turned into action? I guess I'm worried about dilution of the message or potential dilution of the message.
Well, thanks for that question. Steph, Riley, feel free to weigh in. I'll make just initial 2 comments and then see if there are other things. So one has to do with the UN Declaration itself, which is a declaration, not quite a treaty, but some people make that distinction, but maybe a little irrelevant. One of the slides that had come up earlier had talked about regional principles, so broad principles, regional, and then at the level of a nation state. And actually, international law works something like that. So when a state signs on to the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, the idea when they sign on is that it will then get incorporated into local law. So there's an initial investigation if Australia has signed it. In other words, it could be that you could implement the principles of a UN declaration without it actually being referred to as such in national law. So that's one way to ask the question. So I wouldn't be, well, I guess it's useful for advocacy to make reference to it if it seems the principles are not met. But I would say that it's worth an exploration maybe of how the UN declaration in other areas has made into areas of national law. And that might give you a sense of whether it's worth bringing up or not. So that's one. Actually, Steph, I don't know if you have something to say. I lost my second point to that question, but I'll come back to it.
Yeah, I think so we always defer to the leadership within your nation state. So that is one piece of point to take there. I do know that folks in the IDSOB movement there in Australia have always been referring back to UNDRIP as a lot of the one leg of the foundation of the care principles in IDSOB in general. And it is, I think, I am concerned somewhat about your question about dilution, right? So it's hard to get uptake in the first place. So how do we make sure that the application that's occurring is in good faith and doing the right things? And then, but we have seen some places like British Columbia in Canada. So the province itself has been implementing UNDRIP, and you see it more visibly in some of the work that they're doing across kind of not just data, but generally as a foundations for relations type of thing and upholding. But I think that's a good question. I am always concerned about the dilution aspect, especially when there's concerns concurrently about how the application is occurring.
Okay, thank you. That's very helpful.
Yeah, and I think the point did come back. So one way to think about what this model aims to do is if there's a rhetorical acknowledgement of UNDRIP, but very poor implementation, I think part of building out this model is to match, basically hold a level of accountability for signatories. So if they say they've signed UNDRIP, but if the infrastructure does not meet these elements, so again, this is just one interpretation of how UNDRIP plays out. That's the power of the tool, is that you don't have to argue about whether the framework is there or not. They've already signed it. Then your question is, okay, how do you hold them accountable using something like this? And I will add that this is the model, and it's a basis for indicators, which will then, and the indicators basically are ways to evaluate, whether an institution or policy is doing a certain thing. So that's the next phase. And given the different jurisdictional difference, say among Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the US, those indicators will play out differently given what the ecosystem is. And so the goal is, over the next stages is to try to get it, if you will, fleshed out at that jurisdictional level. So thanks for that question. This is a question about outputs that I'll take to heart. Thank you. Matthew?
Hi, thanks for this. And just thanks in general for all the work that's been going on to develop the care principles and thinking through how UNDRIP as a model can influence how we look at indigenous data sovereignty. So I'm with the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada and lead some of the work on resource data management policy here. And I would say that more or less we say the right things in our policies around research data needing to be managed in accordance with principles developed and accepted by Indigenous communities. But the challenge comes when, like, how do we practically implement this, or how do we ensure that the resources needed to effectively manage Indigenous data are provided or in place, or the skills are there? So I guess I'm wondering if there are examples of how different countries or jurisdictions have supported the practical elements of ensuring that Indigenous nations can manage their data effectively. Because I mean, it's expecting a lot of anyone to say manage your data. I mean, we tell universities they have to manage their data, and they raise the challenge of resources, et cetera. And so Indigenous nations are in exactly the same boat of needing resources to do this work. So I guess, are there examples where either institutions or jurisdictions or countries or et cetera have thought through how to support this type of work through resources?
I'll defer to Stephanie and Riley on this, partly because they have worked on projects on either implementing care in specific categories. So I don't know if you want to weigh in on that, and strategies for addressing this challenge of resources, or literally just kind of infrastructural stuff.
I'll jump in quickly and please add anything, Steph. But the work that I'll present in a few minutes on the care data maturity model will go into some more kind of concrete examples of practices that can be adopted by these different sort of data actors, funders, repositories, institutions, for profit and nonprofit, among others. So it's a big question that you ask. It's a really important one. And I think it totally motivates the direction of the work that we're doing now, which is we are having more of this buy-in and acknowledgement, as you say, and interest in implementing care, acknowledging on drip, and people are really at this point of, okay, what does that look like actually in practice? So actually the tri-agency policy in Canada is one example we give for under authority to control for that acknowledgement of free, prior, informed consent. But there is a whole variety of other practices people are taking from, using tools from local contexts, which is an organization I'll talk about a bit, transforming their policies to ensure that before deposit of data, for example, they're, appropriate Indigenous peoples or tribes or authorities have approved the deposit of that data, among many other things. So all that to say, like, there is really great work being done at, say, like, all levels of governance and in these different institutions. We're trying really hard to like codify it into these models. Yeah, hope that gives us a start of something to think about.
That is, thanks.
I think we have time for maybe one more before the next section. Gabriela?
Hi, Gaby Pino from Universidad Nacional in Costa Rica. I have a question, I guess, from the other side of the relationship in this way, because we encounter in Universidad, in our research work, that one of the challenges is encounter the right interlocutor in the communities. Because many, or at least in Costa Rica, many of the indigenous community lack experience on reflecting or empowering their own knowledge, and even less their own data. Then, do you have any experience of or tips that can give us to strengthen, to help strengthening the communities in this empowering way to begin to analyze their own community and how they have to enhance this rights of their own knowledge, and when the researchers arrive to be able to speak with them and understand their rights in face of them.
So I'll do initial few comments, but I'd love to hear Riley's and Stephanie's comments on this. And so what I'm hearing you say is that on the other side, basically the internal autonomy side, there are certain jurisdictions where it's hard to identify what that collective authority looks like or who to talk to recognize that. And so as a start, we've mentioned the Kansas countries already. I think it's a lot or slightly, well, in some ways it's easier when the state has a legal relationship with Indigenous peoples. You have those, you can look those up pretty easily. One of the discussions we're having in our work is even within the US context, as Riley can testify, there are communities in Indigenous peoples that are not recognized, and you face this very same problem. So if you're a researcher going out and researching in certain areas, you might not even know, in quote, that there are Indigenous peoples there. So I'll make one general comment. So on the question of recognition, I think this is a challenge generally, especially if you're talking of policy and infrastructure. And so for researchers, so we can talk about infrastructure and policy, but I think at the level of researchers, it's, or on project basis, very often Indigenous peoples do know what the shape of their community is. That there might have been kind of sustained colonial erasure or neglect, but there is part of the work is actually acknowledging that and learning to listen. In other words, there are, and I'll sorry for some of my reference point is to the African context. When I talked of self-determination and I went through those three phases, there are certain parts of the world where that is lacking. There isn't the recognition of rights. So so I'll speak from an ethics perspective, which is that for researchers and projects at that level, wherever work is being done in a certain area, trying to do, given what the colonial context of a lot of these is, it's not surprising that the answer is not easy to get. And the question is, who do you talk to in community, not just for purposes of the project, but how do you have an exploration of what the underlying structures, which it's rarely they're there in terms of knowing who represents the community. It's a messy situation, but I'll just stop there. Just I think at the ethics level, there's a way to explore that at a smaller level.
I see Stephanie added something in the chat to Gabriela about connecting with colleagues working in the region.
Yes,
Yeah,
that's
no,
great.
there's really exciting work emerging around the globe. And I'll also just add to that, the capacity building piece is so important. We need more experts from our own communities in every institution and discipline where Indigenous data exists. Like in Guam, we talk a lot about how we don't have, Chamorro archaeologists, and that is a huge site of kind of violence and desecration of our sacred sites and our ancestors. And it takes a lot of effort to, transform the institutions and the policies when we don't really have people from our communities advocating for that internally. And we don't always have people from our communities who can, participate on those studies sort of as academic experts. So there's different things that people are doing to try and build those like university community partnerships and have a little bit more participation and engagement, but it's still a little bit removed from that, authority to control the data. And it's a little bit different than having our own experts kind of at the helm of the design of those studies. So yeah, I'll say I think that there's good work being done to build capacity and partnership, but more has to be done so that Indigenous peoples from those communities are the ones actually making decisions about whether it's the unearthing of ancestors or the analysis of data, like really across the whole research life cycle.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, sure. Just a little comment. What we are trying to do is to work with our Indigenous students, because that's something quite new in Costa Rica and in our university. Then we we are looking at them as our key to begin to empowering the communities on these kind of discussions that generally in the communities are not done already. Then thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Stephanie and I always talk about how exciting it is to engage youth in this work because they're in many ways, I think, more prepared than we realize to be leading it. So yes, definitely training them is super important. Okay, I think that if others have questions, please put them in the chat for Dr. Garba. And I think we're going to shift now to the care data maturity model. Correct? Okay. Excellent. Thank you, Ibrahim. Okay, so for the rest of our session, I'm going to give a presentation on our progress on the care data maturity model, and I'll leave a little bit of time for questions and feedback on that as well. First, I want to note that this work is detailed on our Collaboratory for Indigenous Data Governance website. You can scan this QR code for our website. The URL is here as well. Maybe somebody can drop that in the chat if they get a chance. We have a survey you can fill out if you'd like to join a mailing list to stay in touch about the progress of this work. And we have all of our materials and some recordings of previous webinars there online if you'd like to learn more. Okay, so what is the care data maturity model and why are we building it? This actually goes back to the question that Matthew posed, which was, when we have these different entities, different data actors and practitioners, data repositories, universities, and many others who want to endorse or apply care but don't know how to do that in practice, we hope that this is a tool that can really direct that work and that can also serve as an evaluation or assessment tool so that folks can look at their own data ecosystems or projects or data infrastructures and say, how are we doing on maturing the application of care in our system, and what can we do to make targeted improvements? So this is a project a couple of years in the making. Actually, I should say many years. This builds on work that's been going on for a long time. But a couple of years in the making as far as calling it the care data maturity model. And ultimately, the outputs from this will be sort of a coherent, user-friendly tool that will exist online, accompanying guidelines for folks using that tool. And what I've drawn out here is really what we're focusing on developing now and for the last year and a half, 2 years, which are these indicators, as Dr. Garba mentioned for his work in the UNDRIP model, creating these indicators similarly for care that can help to identify measurable or concrete aspects of each principle, really the building blocks. How do you put this stuff into practice? Okay, to say a bit more about the indicator, so these for the care data maturity model seek to operationalize each collective benefit, authority to control, responsibility, and ethics. And this is, and specifically the sub-principles under each. And so for each set of sub-principles, we've developed a high-level criteria that helps to put that sub-principle into practice, and then the draft indicator, which is that most specific concrete action that can be taken to make it happen, right? So here's one example of a high-level criteria that sits under A, authority to control, and specifically A 1.1, which we've drafted as recognizing Indigenous people's rights and interests to their knowledge and data. And the draft indicator here is that a given institution explicitly recognizes IDSOV, for instance, on their website or through the use of different tools like the local context institutional notices, which I can say more about in a couple of slides. So again, this work is in progress. Excuse me. We have been convening with our colleagues in our working group and vetting this work, drafting and redrafting the indicators over the last few years, including at the previous RDA in Salzburg, and with folks across different domains, so publishers, folks that work in data repositories, and more. And we have developed some 36 indicators across CA, R, and E in total. This table is a summary of the kinds of actions that are covered by the indicators under each C-A-R-N-E. An earlier draft version of this is available on the website that I pointed out a few slides ago. And I won't sit here and read all of these at you, but just to give you sort of a flavor of what's covered. Under collective benefits, we've drafted indicators that are focusing on actions like conducting a data needs assessment with Indigenous people. So understanding, what are their data needs so that the subsequent collection and handling of data can support those needs. We also are dealing in collective benefit with things like provenance, things like benefit sharing plans, right? Especially for profit institutions or commercial entities who are collecting Indigenous people's data and using it for some kind of commercial gain or profit, ensuring that Indigenous peoples are essentially receiving some cut of that financial or other benefit, right? Under A, authority to control, which again, we see this really as the heart of the care principles. This brings us to that sort of higher level, or as Dr. Garba said, sort of rhetorical recognition of IDSOV and of Indigenous people's rights to FPIC. This can also involve disclosing the presence of Indigenous data within your institution or holdings to the Indigenous communities to whom those data connect. And this also involves the development of laws, policies, practices that uphold those rights and interests to data. Under our responsibility, this is getting us really thinking about relationship building, capacity building. We have some work with publishers, so working with folks in journals and other publishing entities to develop guidelines to promote the care principles. And so we think a lot about things like equitable attribution, acknowledgement, authorship, and more in that work. We're also thinking under responsibility of things like Indigenous metadata fields, really ensuring that those fields are enabled at the level of the data infrastructure to track things like Indigenous provenance of data. Okay, and then finally under e-ethics, this is thinking about how data ecosystems and projects and research can support the use of Indigenous people's own ethical frameworks. This also involves things like promoting Indigenous people's interpretation and findings related to their data, and other things like compensation of research, sharing copyright, and more. Okay, I'm going to walk you through one example of indicators, and I'll do sort of in situ examples from different institutions and organizations across each of these end users of the tool, essentially. So again, we have this higher level criteria. This is under A1, and it's recognizing Indigenous people's rights to FPIC, or free prior informed consent, involving the use of their data. And we've broken out, based on feedback that we've gotten over time on this work, we've broken out the indicators across these different data actors or end users of the tool, individuals. This could be researchers, individual archivists, and more. For individuals, we're saying that to apply this criteria, they can recognize and apply FPIC through all phases of research projects and outputs, also using iterative consent in their memorandums of understandings or agreements. For nonprofit and for-profit institutions, we're thinking about how they can apply FPIC in their policies, administrative procedures, and practices. And again, coming back to that iterative consent piece. For funders, we are saying that funders may wish to require that recipients of their funds comply with FPIC and provide proof of consent. They may want to work this into things like their data management plans. And then finally, for repositories, requiring proof of consent for depositing of data. Okay, and so I'll walk you through, again, these sort of in situ examples across different contexts. So for individuals, we pulled out this example from IRGA, which is the European Reference Genome Atlas project. If you're not familiar with IRGA, it is this very ambitious project that is seeking to generate reference genomes for all eukaryotic species in Europe. And so they're collecting a ton of data They've established a standard operating procedure with respect to Indigenous data, including how to record sample metadata. This is really important for linking genome sequences to their origins. And so you can see they have fields established for all the relevant sampling permits that may apply, as well as things like proof of compliance with the Nagoya Protocol. And then one more slide on IRGA. They also have fields pertaining to the rights of Indigenous peoples and local communities, including these traditional knowledge or biocultural labels from the organization Local Context. So I've mentioned them a few times. Local Context has created these digital tags that look like this. And essentially, there's a variety of these tags that communicate Indigenous cultural rights and authority that sit in connection to different kinds of data or records. And so these can be used by institutions and also by communities who are able to customize those tags to their needs. So long-winded way of saying IRGA has worked with Local Context to integrate this tool, and they've made the appropriate field available for those researchers who are depositing data. Okay. As I mentioned, we have the Tri-Agency Research Data Management Policy from Canada as an example for sort of operationalizing this recognition of FPIC. So you can see these agencies that are federal granting agencies promoting and supporting research, training, and knowledge transfer and innovation within Canada. They have released this joint research data management policy, recognizing that Indigenous peoples in Canada data connected to Indigenous peoples in Canada must be managed in accordance with those communities' own data principles. And specifically, they say on the basis of free, prior, and informed consent. And Matthew, if you're still here, feel free to add any detail or anything that I missed in the chat on this one. But again, we see this as a concrete example of that acknowledgement of FPIC. Okay. For-profit institutions, I have this example from the genomics-driven drug discovery company known as Variant Bio. And so they work with Indigenous peoples around the world, analyzing their DNA to drive drug discovery. And you can see that they've outlined a number of policies with respect to consent, spanning data collection, use and reuse, and disposal or return of samples. They also have a benefit sharing plan that you can check out on their website as well. Okay, and then one more example. This comes from the University of Arizona Libraries Research Data Repository Policies and Documentation, or REDATA. And so this policy stipulates that in order to deposit any data associated with Indigenous lands, peoples, and resources, the researcher must first meet a variety of policies and approvals, which include ABOR, or the Arizona Board of Regents Tribal Consultation Policy, as well as approvals from appropriate tribal designees, and NIPTAO, or the Native Peoples Technical Assistance Office, must approve any kind of sharing that's going to happen with these data. And then I think Steph is familiar with his example, so feel free to add anything again in the chat if you'd like. And I believe that's all the examples for that indicator. So again, across the entire model, the tool will ultimately kind of walk through those kinds of examples that I just gave you for every single indicator across all of the letters of care. And so right now we're on our maybe third draft of writing out all of the indicators, given feedback that we've gotten from folks. This work wouldn't happen without the feedback, so we really welcome it. I've put a couple of reflection questions here, but definitely welcome any other feedback or questions that you might have about this tool. We hope that we'll bring this to the field for use by anyone who works with Indigenous data in the coming years, and hopefully that it's a tool that's useful to you. So yes, if you have any input on, how this may apply to your context, maybe things that you'd like to see in this tool, we welcome it now. Thank you. Matthew.
Nope. Thanks for, I don't have anything to add to your description of the Trident 2 policy. That was great. But I think what we find is the interesting difference between words and action. And we thought, for example, we were pretty clear in our policy that we expected institutions in their institutional strategies and how they support data management to include language that discusses Indigenous data sovereignty and how they live that out. But a good number of them didn't. And I heard the other day that one, for whatever reason, was actually quite reluctant too. And I need to follow up on that to understand reasons for that. But I just wanted to say, I think this will be super useful because one of the things as we're rolling out DMP requirements, we're not struggling with, we're working through is how to support assessors in what to look for in these DMPs. So it will be super useful in helping us think through, well, in the context of an Indigenous data sovereignty, what do they need to be looking for and considering? Because we have some guidance in the broader under the broader ruling of ethics with research involving or with Indigenous communities more broadly, but not specifically on the data question. So I think this will be very, very useful. So thanks a lot for your work on this.
Thank you. I see Stephanie, so I want to go to her, and I want to say thank you for that feedback. And actually, that is really important input for us to hear of like what, we use your policy as an example, and to hear how that's actually playing out in practice and gives us ideas about how we might offer direction to kind of hopefully help people like fall in line a little more, live up to these expectations a little more, Steph.
Fall in line works. Yeah, that's a good line.
Yeah, I think that was really interesting, Matthew, because the same thing, so that redata example that Riley showed there, it only took a week before they had a violation. And it was researchers who were trying to deposit indigenous languages from South America, and didn't have any approvals for the deposit of the data around those languages. And even when they were asked, they were like, wait, why do I have to get, they still, and so there's missing those pieces around, obviously they had not been educated at all. And then therefore, because they had not been educated when they read the deposit requirements and checked the box for the deposit requirements, they still did not believe that applied to them. And so that and then some subsequent experiences led to the tightening of language. And so this is another thing it's hard with regulations, right? But if you're doing policies and other pieces, you can think of them more as living documents so that you have updates over time. So for instance, working with our state here around a state policy, and we're writing into the policy that the language needs to be revisited annually, at least. And so really being intentional about that, because you can think that you're clear, right? Super clear.
Yeah.
And then nope.
And I think, and we've talked about these strategies being evergreen, but we need to think about ways of engaging back with institutions because we're not assessing them, but we do require that they be made public, so it is out there for everyone to see. And we have done a report, which, if not on our website, no, it is on our website, I'm sure, that looks at these strategies and talks a little bit about where Indigenous data sovereignty is or is not included. I also just want to say, so I also at RDA chair the funders forums. This is just a group of research funders that meets usually just before the RDA plenary. And we've been thinking about, as we think towards the next plenary already in Australia, topics that we'd like to engage the funders on. And I think this would be a really great topic to engage funders on. Obviously, it's very relevant in the Australian context, certainly for the Canadian context. And so maybe we can have some follow-up conversations around how we could think about, but bringing funders into this conversation in a very concrete and practical way.
I think that is an excellent idea. Let's definitely follow up on that. We're hoping to send some of our team to that one. So yeah, thank you so much, Matthew. It's great. Other questions, comments, feedback?
Just following up on good morning all, or evening, or whatever time zone you're in. It's Keith Russell here from the Australian Research Data Commons. Yeah, we're really busy preparing for the International Data Week, and yeah, there will be an opening plenary session on Indigenous data governance and what that looks like in the care principles. So it's definitely going to come up in the in International Data Week. There's also a number of people looking to put in sessions around the topic. So please have a look at that. And SciDataCon also has a call for sessions that's going to be closing soon. So have a look there if you might be interested in putting in a submission. It's really, and Riley, thanks. It's great to see how you're progressing on the capability maturity model. It's amazing what you've done here. So yeah. I find it's really interesting because from their data maturity model, there you're assessing the characteristics of a data set, whereas what you're having to assess here is the behavior of humans or organizations.
Yeah.
So it's a little bit, and that's a little bit harder, it's a little bit less objective. Sometimes it's easier just to say a data set has appeared or not.
That's
whereas
right.
yeah, you're asking a much more difficult question. Yes.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. I think I even neglected to mention that this work is inspired completely by the Fair Data Maturity Model. We have looked a lot to their process to understand, how they went through their own iterations of creating the indicators, and it's been really informative for us. And as you say, it is in some ways quite complex compared to kind of the binary yes/no if you have a PID or not. That said, we're really fortunate to draw on excellent work that people have done the world over to improve Indigenous data governance in their contexts. I think any indicator that you see comes from a practice that we have seen or work that people are doing to improve Indigenous data governance. So all of this work actually started based on this giant spreadsheet landscaping activity that our colleagues had done to kind of keep track of and collect good examples of Indigenous data governance across all of these different settings and contexts. So it is complex to write these things out and especially to make them clear and sort of concrete, but everything you're seeing is like very precedented and there are things that are happening. So I like to remind people of that because it can feel difficult, especially if you're working within an institution that's not really thought of these things or codified their responsibilities to Indigenous data sovereignty in any of their policies. So it is hard work, but it's already being done. And actually, we work pretty closely with some folks in Australia, including in CSIRO and different universities who are doing excellent work in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities around Indigenous data sovereignty. So we learn a lot from the work happening over there as well. Thank you. Other questions, comments? What time is it? We've got a couple more minutes.
I had a quick comment that follows on Keith's point about the difference between gauging a data set versus measuring human behavior, if you will. And I think so the title of the UNDRIP model is a relational model. And I've moved away from that, but I think there's something that the section on the UNDRIP model that had that flow chart with Indigenous peoples on one side and external data actors on the other. There's a kind of a stereotype in Indigenous knowledges that talks or metaphysics or epistemology about knowledge being relational. And it's easy to kind of stereotype it, but I think part of what you're pointing out with the care data maturity model, in some ways, that's what the UNDRIP model is trying to do, is to try to provide not so much a checklist or objectifying the relationship or data, but trying to guide the interactions within research to be relational, like you're keeping people on both sides. And that I think that's very tricky to do because science, again, the mode of thinking is objectivity. You always want the subject here, the object over there, and that's how you measure. And so I think it's a bit challenging just generally to try to bring this relational aspect where you keep peoples and people on either side of that pole, and for these principles to continue to be a conversation as opposed to some kind of abstract model. So thanks for pointing that out.
just to tell you that it will help us a lot because we are trying to build up a policy because we have a lot of experience and work with indigenous people, and I guess most of the people are quite ethical in the way they work with the people, but we don't have something that is standardized and systematic and build up as a policy, as something that reflect the point of view of a whole institution with the relationship of indigenous people, and that include later on, because I think that is more difficult, the way the teachers and professors um, take in account when they build up their programs, their curriculums, the indigenous knowledge. And there's a little bit more problems for us because of we have that autonomous way the teachers thinks about their programs, and well, that is something that I guess is something that we will have to think about later on, because a lot of persons treat the indigenous topics in their way, not asking the people how they see their history and their knowledge and their topics.
Yes, thank you, Gabriela. Um, you raised such important and challenging points. And I think actually that was some feedback that we got from some Indigenous faculty over the last few years on the data maturity model, is that we need to, have more indicators that are thinking about like methodological issues and research methodology, and how to try and promote more Indigenous methodology in university research. And so we think a lot about what kinds of resources we can make available with trainings and things like this. But yeah, I think you're pointing to like a big structural issue that probably needs a bit more than just, a training module or something like this. But yeah, thank you. I'll keep thinking about that kind of research methodologies piece. Thank you. I think we're coming up on time. Any last questions or comments people want to squeeze in?
I did have just a quick comment in reference to Gabriela's point. I think the issue of there seem to be certain things that are just beyond data, so methods of teaching. One thing you did say just reminded me that there is, and I just looked it up now, I haven't looked at it in detail, but there is an article in UNDRIP on education. And so that might be something to just scan through, maybe to just inform how we think of it in terms of what nation state obligations are, because that is a blind spot in some countries, and just given other conversations in other countries that perhaps should know better, is all the question of education and how to teach about the history of indigenous peoples and others is always a little tricky. But maybe I think it's Article 14 or something like that. A good point. Thank you.
Thank you, Ibrahim. Okay, I think with that, we'll get ready to wrap up. I want to say a big sainamase. Thank you to all of you for your time and your participation and your valuable feedback. And thank the many institutions and partners that make this work happen. And Stephanie and Ibrahim, anything you want to say to close us out as well? Please do.
Just, Janan, thank you to everybody. Really excited to be back in this environment. And we're hoping to have a number of folks at Indigenous Data Week next October. So thank you for joining us, and we'll see you all there.